My name is Steve Long, and I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships with the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. I've been doing environmental policy work for 40 years. Can't believe that just came out of my mouth. And I've been like Tarzan, swinging from vine to vine. My first vine was hazardous waste. My second vine was recycling. And now my third vine for the past 16 years at the Nature Conservancy has been climate change and land and water conservation. And let me ask a quick question. Is the volume of my voice sufficient? Can people hear me well enough? Yeah, can anyone not hear me? Okay, good. And for the past 12 years, I taught graduate students and undergraduate students at Suffolk and Tufts universities. And finally, this year, it broke my heart, but I had to give up doing it because I just had too much on my plate. And turning 62 yesterday, I said, I'm just too tired. I don't have the energy I did when I was 12 years ago. And so that's me. And then the Nature Conservancy, we are a global organization. We are in over 78 countries. We have 5,500 staff. We're the largest conservation organization in the world. We have a science-based staff, and our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And our big focus is on climate change and biodiversity. We have crises in both fronts. So what we do with our work is we develop the science, we apply it in the field, we develop partnerships to prove our projects in the field, and then we replicate our successes with public policy and private partnerships. So I'm a key element of that public policy piece. However, I just work for our Massachusetts chapter, but I collaborate on regional and national scales. So that's the beauty of the Nature Conservancy, is we have people who have expertise that I can bring to Massachusetts, and I can import my expertise to other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So with the Conservancy, I've been to Micronesia, I've been to South America, I've been to Canada, and it's just an amazing organization. I was on the phone yesterday with our North American staff on renewable energy. How do you site it without destroying nature and destroying human communities? And I got some great advice. So I'm really feel very, very fortunate to be working at the Nature Conservancy. So because we're science-based, and apologies for the size here, I'll send this slide deck around so you can see this later. Because we're science-based, we are very focused on metrics. That's how we measure our successes. So we have metrics in several different domains. And I'll be focusing today on what we do in the climate change sphere. But you can see we have metrics on land and water, on lands, on people, and oceans. And these metrics look at things like the amount of geography covered, the number of hectares in the ocean and in land, the number of river health measured by connectivity, how a river flows freely, and measuring climate change impacts like storms and flooding, et cetera, by the number of people who are in a safer place because of our work. And we measure this specifically relative to our work in the field, related to policy and related to private partnerships. So each country, these are global goals, each country and each state and each region figures out what is their best contribution towards these goals. So our Massachusetts chapter used these goals to develop our strategies.
Are those national goals?
These are global goals. Yep, global goals. So with climate, we want 100 million more people to be safer from climate change impacts. And Massachusetts is accounting for 2 million of that across the whole globe. So we know our stuff in Massachusetts. We do a pretty good job. So in terms of climate change, we work in 3 domains. One is reducing the source of emissions. We know that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, so we work to reduce emissions at their source. So that means transportation, electricity, and buildings. It also means making sure our electricity is generated in the most environmentally preferable way possible. So when you site solar energy on land, you don't want to destroy all the carbon stocks and the carbon sequestration that's happening in those forests. So we use site suitability, that's a mouthful, methodology to be sure that solar siting is happening in the right places, on buildings and on lands that are already disturbed. We also work on climate adaptation. We like using what we call nature-based solutions to address the impacts of climate change. So we work on restoring floodplains and riparian areas. We work on making sure that coastal areas are not subject to erosion using natural methods. So a lot of people ask why Massachusetts? We're a pipsqueak relative to the rest of the world geographically. We have, 7 million people in Massachusetts compared to the 8 billion we have on the planet. It was just announced 8 billion the other day. It's because we're leaders. We are leaders in the US and we are global leaders. And we need to prove that we can do the climate change work in Massachusetts to show the rest of the world that it can be done. And today, at the anniversary of the insurrection of January 6th, there are still some people who doubt the work that a lot of good people are trying to do on climate change. And I was meeting with Congressman McGovern's staffer recently, and he said, I'm kind of looking at this like the Affordable Care Act. There were a lot of doubters thinking that providing care through the Affordable Care Act wasn't going to work. But now that more people have insurance and more people are healthier, people are now buying into it. And I think that's one of the things that will be happening now that we have federal funding going to things like clean energy, creating jobs, and making sure our communities are more resilient. So I think we will have fewer doubters. So I'm a little more optimistic. So in Massachusetts, we have to think about what frame are we dealing with politically, socially, and with our infrastructure and with communities. So that frame changes all the time. When we're doing our strategic planning, we have to think about how what we do relates to the rest of what's happening in Massachusetts. So you can see here, there's been a really big focus on equity and justice. There's been a real awakening, appropriately so, in some of the white-led conservation organizations that we need to do a better job on equity and justice. Also, too, rather than thinking about technology, the conservation and climate change NGOs that are working in this space are focusing on more of a people-centered approach. How do we engage communities? How do we learn what people want and need? And it's not only what they want, but how do we deliver that so it gets to the right places? We also think about taking a holistic approach. We don't want things working at cross purposes. We don't want to do a bad job of citing renewable energy to make the biodiversity crisis even worse. And we all agree that we need to use the best science, which Massachusetts is a leader on, and we need partnerships and collaboration. We can't rely on any one sector to do this work. It can't be just the government, it can't be the private sector, it can't be universities. So then that comes to thinking about our current context. What's happening in Massachusetts? Where are our opportunities and challenges? So fortunately, we've had consistently good governors with Governor Patrick, Governor Baker, and now Governor Healy, all focused on climate change. They all have a different emphasis. And looking at the Healy-Driscoll administration, their emphasis is on climate action, reducing emissions. They appointed a first-in-the-nation climate chief. This is the first time a state has appointed somebody who looks across all functions of state government. And that chief has the authority to make change. It used to be that all the climate change work came out of the environmental agencies and energy agencies, but this is a whole of government approach. With the federal funding that's come in Massachusetts, we are so ready for it. I compare us to having a giant catcher's mitt, like Yogi Berra. Giant catcher's mitt to capture all the federal funding because we've done such a good job setting up programs to capture that federal funding. And renewable energy deployment is a huge priority. Offshore wind energy just started generating its first power in Massachusetts just a few days ago. And we used to be number one in solar development in terms of the amount of solar development, and we're one of the smallest states in the country. So how do we frame that up? We want to be sure that the energy lawyers who all have the leadership positions in the Healy-Driscoll administration know that nature has some value in this fight, that nature can help reduce the greenhouse gases in the air, and it can also be a really useful tool when we're talking about managing impacts. We know even though we have this huge influx of federal money, there's limited capacity to deploy that money and implement that money in state agencies and at municipal scales. I used to work for a Western Massachusetts state senator. There were town clerks who worked out of their kitchens. They had a notebook on a kitchen table. So we have to think about what scale we're delivering these services at. We don't have a dedicated source of state funding. We have regional funding through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we have the state borrowing money for adaptation. So I'm leading on a piece of legislation that would establish a new source of funding. And we also need to make sure that energy is sited well. So all right, here's the public participation part, now that you're all digesting and going into a food coma. So here's what recipe do you think you need from state government? What components, what elements of state government do we need to be successful in climate change? Paul, you're in Elders Climate Action. I think you probably have some good ideas.
What do we need from the state?
Yeah.
Well, basically, one thing is just to get the utilities fully on board. We need to double, maybe triple our electric production. So you have to be ready for that.
Absolutely. Others? Yes.
I'd like to see more focus on potential for geothermal instead of all the stuff above the ground.
Okay. Yep. Ground source heat pumps are a good way to do that. Others? And what sort of mechanical things do we need from state government, like partnerships or programs? So I have answers on my next slide, but I always like crowdsourcing ideas. Yes.
I think we need some sort of tax credits or some sort of program to help people pay for converting their homes from oil to geothermal, for instance.
Absolutely. Mass Save is a good place to look for that. They have a lot of good. We just converted our oil burners to air source heat pumps, and it was amazing the subsidies they provided. Mass Save.
What we really need is for people to know what's available.
Yes.
Because there's federal and state, there's all kinds of subsidies, and most people are totally unaware of it.
Yeah, we have a two-family house on my mom's side of the house. It was practically free because she was retired and did not have an income. So.
Yeah, and along with that, there's a change last year a little bit. We haven't followed through, but taxes are not the ways. Tax credits and tax-oriented funding is not the way that something like a church is able to take advantage. So we need to have more attention on organizations with low funds and that are not taxed as the way of.
It's a good point. Interfaith Power and Light is an organization of faith communities that helps churches figure out how to. I see you nodding. You already know about them. Great. All right. So in my political science brain, because that's where I have my master's degree and that's where I teach at Suffolk and Tufts, these are the ingredients that I think we need. Laws and regulations that require action, science backing that action, plans to help implement the what's needed, programs to help get those plans on the ground, staff capacity, public-private partnerships. We can't have it rest on the back of government. Robust funding, excuse me, local implementation, whether it's local government or partnerships with local organizations, community engagement to hear what people say, just like you did just now, governance and oversight, and political support. So let's walk through Massachusetts and see where we are relative to that recipe with both. I'm going to cover two different things. The two-pronged approach to climate change are two sides of the coin. We need to think about how we are reducing emissions, and that's the first part of my presentation. The second part's going to be more about how do we do adaptation, how do we manage the impact. So I love playing with words. This is mitigation. We call it avoiding the unmanageable, and adaptation, we call it managing the unavoidable.
The Venn diagram has that perspective.
Absolutely, especially with nature. Yeah. So you can see here's our emissions profile in Massachusetts. This is broken down by green is households, blue is businesses, yellow is electricity generation, and gray is other. And right now, the main source of emissions in Massachusetts is transportation. Number 2 is buildings. Number 3 is electricity. And Massachusetts enacted a law back in 2021, the roadmap law, that requires us to reduce our emissions by 85% from 1990 levels by the year 2050, 85% or more. And then those remaining emissions to be drawn out of the atmosphere by nature, whether it's wetlands or forests or other forms, or technically man-made carbon sequestration. So you can see here, we're here now. Well, that's the 1990 base level all the way up to 2050. And each of these colors is a different source of emissions that will be reduced. And then we get to net zero by drawing down the emissions that are in the atmosphere. So we're a net zero state. There are about, I think, 11, maybe 14 net zero states. So how have we taken the path to figure out what to do about this? What's the planning process been? First, there were technical studies done in each of the sectors: transportation, buildings, electricity, and natural and working lands. And that technical analysis looked at what the sources of emissions are and how we might reduce them. Then we did scenarios. We said, what's Massachusetts going to look like in 2050? What's our population going to be? What do we forecast our economy to look like? And the scenarios came out with 7 different pathways to achieving net zero. And then we did an analysis to say, of those 7 pathways, which ones make the most sense? Which ones are implementable? Which ones are fundable? Which ones are achievable? And those ended up in 2 plans. There's one plan that covers 2025 to 2030, and another that covers all the way up to 2050. And I've sat on the state's climate council for the past 12 years, helping develop and do this work on these 3 elements. So in those plans, we're looking at full electrification of the transportation and building sectors, moving away from fossil fuels and generating that electricity from renewable sources. We're also looking at increasing the amount of carbon that's stored and sequestered in nature. And that's the focus I'm taking today. I'm not an expert on buildings or transportation. I know a lot about renewable energy, but I know most about nature. So we also have a very robust tracking system in Massachusetts. You can go to the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs website, and you can see a dashboard that tracks where we are on emissions reductions. And the Massachusetts just issued its first report card. How are we doing on both reducing emissions and managing impacts? That report card came out in late October, when I was on vacation. So I'm going to talk mostly about nature-based solutions, and there's 2 parts of that. I'm going to focus first on natural climate solutions, which are ways to protect, manage, and restore nature to help do a better job of drawing carbon out of the air, carbon pollution out of the air. And then I'll focus on nature-based solutions. So how do we define those? And my slide's not advancing. There it is. All right, I'm going to play you a quick video, and this will take a minute. And we'll see Greta Thunberg talking about, why is that not exiting? Sorry, folks. You're learning I'm not the most adept computer guy. I just wanted to show you a short video. There we go. All right, hopefully this isn't too loud. So this is about nature drawing carbon pollution from the atmosphere. We'll see if this works.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. But this alone will not be enough. Lots of solutions are talked about. But what about a solution that is right in front of us? I'll let my friend George explain.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. A tree is an example of a natural climate solution. Mangroves, peat bogs, jungles, marshes, seabeds, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, they take carbon out of the air and lock it away. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate. These natural climate solutions could make a massive difference.
Pretty cool, right?
But only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Here's the crazy part. Right now, we are ignoring them. We spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on natural-based solutions.
Natural climate solutions get just 2% of all the money used on tackling climate breakdown.
This is your money. It is your taxes and your savings.
Even more crazy, right now when we need nature the most, we're destroying it faster than ever.
Up to 200 species are going extinct every single day.
Much of the Arctic ice is gone. Most of our wild animals have gone. Much of our soil has gone.
So what should we do?
What should you do?
It's simple. We need to protect, restore, and fund. Protect. Tropical forests are being cut down at the rate of 30 football pitches a minute.
Where nature is doing something vital, we must protect it.
Restore. Much of our planet has been damaged.
But nature can regenerate, and we can help ecosystems bounce back.
Fund.
We need to stop funding things that destroy nature and pay for things that help it.
It is that simple. Protect, restore, fund.
This can happen everywhere. Many people have already begun using natural climate solutions. We need to do it on a massive scale.
You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts.
So I always like breaking things up a little bit. You don't want to hear me talk the whole time, but that's pretty inspiring. I always get a little cheered up watching that. So natural climate solutions, what are we doing in Massachusetts about natural climate solutions? And how are we fostering them? So as Greta was saying, it's protect and restore, but in Massachusetts, we're also thinking about manage. how do we also manage our forests, our wetlands, and our coastal areas? And as you heard Greta talking, it's a lot of different domains, and George mentioned those as well. So it's really about two things with nature: retaining what's already in the soil and the vegetation. Trees are primarily made of carbon. They suck it out of the atmosphere, and that makes the tree. This happens with soil too. So we need to retain the carbon that's there. That means we need to make sure that trees and soil are healthy. We also need to protect and make sure that those forests and other ecosystems are able to suck more carbon out of the atmosphere and do it in a more robust way. So how's that happening in Massachusetts? And you can see it. It's really meaningful in Massachusetts. It's right now, currently, our ecosystems draw down about 5.5 million metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere. That's about 7 or 10% of the carbon that's generated in Massachusetts every year. 7 or 10% is drawn down by nature. If we do a better job of protect, manage, and restore, we can draw down an additional 1 million to 2 million metric tons. Those numbers get more meaningful as we reduce our emissions from these other sources. So as we get down to 85% reduced emissions from those sources, those 5 million or 7 or 8 million metric tons that we're drawing down are more significant. And we don't see nature as the panacea, as George and Greta were saying. The first things we have to do are reduce our emissions. So you can see the numbers here.
Can you go back to that?
Say again?
Can you go back to that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Saying that we have 5 being extracted now, and
Yep.
an additional 1 to 2 could be extracted?
Could be, yes. If the Nature Conservancy worked with the U.S. Climate Alliance to do an analysis of what we could potentially do in the protect, manage, and restore frames. And if we do a good job on all 3, we can draw down an additional 1 million to 2 million metric tons.
Yeah, well, I'll save it for a question.
Okay. So protect is fairly straightforward. That's land conservation, either acquisitions or a conservation restriction where the owner agrees not to develop a portion of their land. Right now, we have a metric in Massachusetts in our state climate plan of 40% land conserved by 2050. It's ambitious, but it's achievable. Right now, we're at 27% conserved in Massachusetts. So this means doubling the pace of conservation. It's going to require a lot of funding and a lot of very innovative programs. It's not just one frame of acquiring land. We also need to think about forest management. Just this week, a panel of 12 PhD scientists working through the Commonwealth came out with a series of recommendations about how we can manage our forests in a climate smart way. And they basically said the best thing we can do is leave them alone. And we can have more reserves, areas that are untouched. But there are some areas that require attention and management. Sometimes Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, will buy what used to be a monoculture plantation of trees. That's not a healthy forest. You need diverse species. If you have one species of tree and they get a disease, they all die, and you lose your carbon stocks and your sequestration. So a lot of times what happens with management is you're going to an unhealthy system and trying to help it be healthier.
Steve,
Yes.
is the Department of Forest, I don't know what the department is, that's in charge of cutting down trees.
Yes.
Are they buying into this?
Yes, they are. Yeah, so there are 2 agencies that own forest land. One is the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The other is the Department of Fish and Game. And Department of Conservation and Recreation manages land for recreation, for passive recreation like hiking, and active recreation like mountain bikes. And then there's Department of Fish and Game, which manages land for wildlife, And they're paid for, the most of their land is paid for through hunting and fishing fees. So they manage land for wildlife, not only for species protection, but for hunters and fishers. So they will sometimes manage a forest for different types of species. Like a rabbit needs a different type of forest than a bird, like a woodcock.
So how much timbering is going on at this point in time?
It's about 7,000 acres a year.
That's a lot.
Relatively speaking, I think we're 6 or 7 million acres in Massachusetts. So 7,000 in the scale, and this at 27% owned. It's actually, because they're managing it for all those purposes. And the timbering is not done for the private sector benefit. It's done to manage the forests for those values. It's not like they open the bid to a commercial harvester and say, have at it. The state methodically says, on a science basis, why do we need to manage this forest? And then they hire a commercial harvester because they don't have enough foresters in the state agency to do it. So there's some confusion when people say, oh, there's a commercial harvest happening. They think it means that the forest is being harvested for timber purposes, but it's actually being managed for forest health and biodiversity. So they hire private contractors to do that. So one of the things that's happening is most of our wood products that we get in Massachusetts, if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or Butler Lumber and Maynard, most of that's coming from outside Massachusetts. So there's a big carbon footprint, and a lot of those forests are not managed as sustainably as we manage our forests. So at UMass, they built a building at UMass Amherst that has structural lumber. They created composite structural lumber. So this is something new that's replacing steel and concrete in buildings. And it's a renewable resource. And concrete, as folks who follow climate change know, is one of the most carbon intensive generating industries. So coming down to restoration, our analysis showed that we could get the most bang for the buck planting along floodplains and riparian areas along rivers and streams. A lot of those, because we have old mill towns, are in cities. So Massachusetts has this great program called Greening the Gateway Cities, where they fund the planting of trees and get people from underserved communities jobs planting those trees, and they work with local organizations. And those trees go on people's private property, where they provide shade in the summer and a windbreak in the winter. So it actually saves people on their energy bills. That's how the program originated. When we were lobbying for this program in 2014, we called it the Energy Trees Program, because it was saving people money on their utility bills. So here's a quote from a nationally known figure. Christine Figueres headed up the COP, the coalition, the convening of the parties, where she talks about the need of natural climate solutions. All right. So let's take a stretch break for a minute. Just stand up. Everyone stand up for a minute, because we have about 10 more minutes of presentation. I want you to reach for high goals. This is the grassroots organizer stretch. Reach for high goals, broaden your base, and then reach down to the grassroots. So you reach for high goals, broaden your base, and go down to the grassroots. All right. So I'm gonna take a deep breath. I'm gonna start up again. I got about 10 more minutes. All right. So the next part of this presentation is about how do we use nature to manage the impacts of climate change. We've all heard horrific stories. We all have personal stories. My sister's art gallery burned down in Maui. My cousins in Texas could not go outside last summer. It's kind of like our February. And look what happened in, was it Leominster with the flooding, where houses were taken out. So I never like starting my presentations with all the gloom and doom, because we all hear so much gloom and doom. I like going right to the solutions. So this part of the presentation is about how do we use nature to manage the impacts of climate change. So we got to think about two different frames. One, what are the natural hazards we already have? Flooding, heat, fire, etc. And then how does climate change exacerbate those problems? Climate change is one of the causes of those problems, but a lot of those factors come in that aren't related to climate change. But climate change is like the exclamation point. It makes all of these natural hazards worse. So then we have to think about two different frames with climate adaptation, managing the impacts. First, adaptation. How do we change our systems to better manage these impacts? And then second, resilience. How do we manage these systems so we can bounce back better? So it's two things. It's preparedness and it's bouncing back. So if you do a better job on preparedness, you have less investment in bouncing back. If you do a better job on preparedness, it's better for equity and racial justice because the communities that are hit first and worst are often those communities that were redlined during the 40s and 50s, those communities that have the most pernicious environmental problems. So if we do a better job on preparedness, when the impacts come, those folks who can't afford to bounce back will be in a better place. So preparedness is super important. So this gives you a sense of how iterative the Massachusetts policy history on adaptation has been. And I only cover up to 2018, but you can see that we started off with a climate change adaptation report that talked about the problems and made some suggestions. Some of us weren't happy that the suggestions weren't robust enough, so we filed some legislation. That prompted the state to invest more money in climate change adaptation. In 2015, there were blizzards. There was a drought in 2016. We had bad coastal storms in 2017. So Governor Baker issued an executive order that required the state develop a plan and that the state set up technical assistance for cities and towns. And these two were so successful, we got them codified into law in a big spending bill. So this is what I spent my life doing. So there are a bunch of things that came out of this. One is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. That's my baby. That was based on a municipal technical assistance toolkit that was developed by the Nature Conservancy that we brought to Massachusetts. So it helps cities and towns learn what is forecast to happen in terms of climate change impacts by getting them a technical expert. And then it walks them through a planning process. It brings together multiple stakeholders from all sectors of the community to see how those forecasts are going to impact their infrastructure, pipes, wires, poles, the infrastructure, roads, their economy, their well-being in the state, how in the town, and also societal, what the impacts will be. So it looks at their vulnerabilities, where they might be subject to big risks, but it also looks at their strengths. And it gives the cities and towns a chance to think about these, have it down on paper, and then when they're doing things like an open space plan or a master plan or a transportation plan, they can look at this data and plan accordingly and make smarter investments. The second thing that the state has is the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team. This helps state agencies make decisions about their investments and their programs. And they recently developed a new tool that developers can use to look at areas that are high risk. So when the State Economic Development Agency is helping foster development or road building or whatever, they require the contractors and the developers making proposals to look at what level of risk they have. So here's another video that I'd like to share with you. And this one is about nature-based solutions. This one's a little more mellow. And it doesn't have Greta. There we go. Oh, I don't know why it stopped, but good enough. So I realized I made a mistake earlier. I think it's only 1,000 acres a year that are converted from the state doing forest management, not 7,000. 7,000 is how many acres we lost every 3 years to solar development. So my apologies.
Lost to what?
Solar development. Going the wrong way. Oh, what happened here? But that's been reduced because we made lots of noise and got the solar incentives changed. Okay, so nature-based solutions, you saw that it's used to manage hazards, and the mantra that we used with the legislature was avoid costs for cities and towns, enhance safety for people, and provide environmental services. That worked. It was interesting when I was pushing for funding for dam removals, just the mere fact that it would provide fish passage and enhance biodiversity didn't work. So I teamed up with the State Engineering Association that could speak to safety and the State Municipal Association that could speak to avoided costs. And I always would do all the organizing and set up the meetings with legislators. The engineers would lead, the municipalities would go second, and I'd go last. And we had to connect biodiversity to the economy. So luckily, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said that because of the fishing economy, the angling brings in like 4 or 5, is it billion or million? I'm sorry, $450 million a year from angling, and then our coastal, our ocean fishing economy is about 10 or $11 billion a year. So we tied river health to those two things. So here are some examples of nature-based solutions. This is a farm along the Taunton River that went fallow, and we worked with the farmer, with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and restored it to a floodplain. So you can see the Taunton River now floods that area rather than going downstream and flooding the city of Taunton. You can see this is in Plymouth. It's a before and after picture, left and right. We have over 2,800 dams in Massachusetts, 85% of which no longer serve their intended purpose. So my big mission up through 2012 was getting funding to remove those dams. And we have a great, very active state agency and division called the Division of Ecological Restoration. They so far have removed 70 dams in Massachusetts using the funding that we helped secure. So you can see how beautiful and healthy the system looks on the right compared to on the left. Another thing that we worked on was right-sizing bridges and culverts. When Tropical Storm Irene came through Western Mass, it isolated communities. People couldn't get food shopping, to hospitals, to healthcare appointments. Rivers had blown out bridges and culverts. So we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to figure out how to right-size bridges and culverts. And the beauty of it is it not only has them be safer, but it allows for wildlife and fish passage. Then with water infrastructure, we worked to make sure that nature is on the menu to manage stormwater. And you can see our very own Jamie Eldridge in the picture here. And this is in Cambridge. If you go to the terminus at the Alewife station, you can see this beautiful park that's been restored that captures all the stormwater and filters it before it goes into a tributary of the Mystic River. And that was because we pushed for funding for nature-based solutions. And then coastal restoration, there's so much to do. We only have, I think, 7% of the eelgrass that used to be there, and we only have 10% of the oyster beds that used to be there. So we're working to restore those two in coastal restoration. So how are we going to do this? What's this weird map? So a lot of people talk about just transitioning now. Since it's January 6th, I thought I'd put in these slides. A lot of people talk about the divide in our country. And if you look at a map of the US, well, the typical map they show on election night, you could see this sort of bi-coastal thing of blue on the east and west coasts and red in the center of the country. But this is the US map morphed out by gradation. This is the 2020 election, going lighter blue to darker blue for Biden, lighter red to darker red for Trump. So you can see the gradations, and then it's blown up by population. So you can see that there's a lot more middle ground of light blue and pink areas where people can work on climate together. And our organization works with two public opinion pollers, one that typically works with Democrats, one that typically works with Republicans. We had them do research on over 1,000 public opinion polls to figure out how to talk between the divide in our country about climate change. And the words in the left-hand column are words that trigger conservatives to react negatively. So the words on the right-hand column are the words to use instead when you want to have a civil conversation with people. So there's a lot of research. Yale, the climate social science folks at Yale do a lot of research on this too. So you can see that there's a lot of ground to be gained. So there's my contact information. This is really hard work. It sometimes keeps me up at night. And the one thing that buoys my spirit is knowing that there are people out here that are doing good work, like Elders Climate Action, where Paul and Russ are involved, that there are really good, strong partners out there, that there are people who are continuing to push state government to do good things. And it buoys my spirit knowing that Massachusetts is doing things that are replicable across the country and across the world. And it really comes down to all of us doing our part. We don't have to be policy experts. We don't have to have a PhD in energy or science. You can really get engaged just because you care. And policymakers can recognize that and do the good work. Are there questions? Yes.
If you fly over Massachusetts, it looks like it's pretty much wall-to-wall trees. Even in suburban, even in populated areas like this.
Yes.
And so where is the space to add? Is it all in cities?
No. We're about 60+% forested in Massachusetts. You're exactly right. So the State Department of Energy Resources did one analysis called the technical potential of solar, and Mass Audubon did another study called Growing Solar and Protecting Nature. Both studies used mapping of areas that are the built environment, less sensitive natural areas, and highly sensitive natural areas. And both studies say there's enough room to do ground-mounted solar without sacrificing biodiversity, without sacrificing those carbon-rich forests. It's just a question of how do we use the policy toolkit to do that.
Add trees to this state. It seems like there's no space.
Oh, we definitely can add trees. Right now, there are areas that used to be forested that are no longer forested. The two major opportunities are floodplains and riparian areas. The riparian areas are above the stream banks. And there's several 100,000 acres where that can happen. Yes?
So from a carbon sequestration point of view, forest sounds like it's the best thing to do. How much better is a forest than a healthy open land otherwise?
Ooh, that's a good question. I wish I had my science experts here because I'm not going to give you an accurate answer. I know that wetlands are more carbon rich and coastal areas, especially salt marshes, are more carbon rich. There are a lot of protections already in place in law for those places. Forests, especially older forests with larger trees, sequester more carbon than an open space area. It's the
10% or?
I can't give you a number, but I know it's a lot. I mean, there was this great study done where somebody planted 2 trees in buckets, and they watered the trees on a regular basis. They weighed the soil before they put the trees in, and they analyzed the soil before they put the trees in. And it made them realize that the trees were drawing all of their carbon from the atmosphere, not from the soil. So that was really interesting. So, and again, I'm not a scientist. That might not be 100% accurate, but that I read that anecdote. Yes, Eleanor.
This is kind of minor, but being a gardener, I'm noticing big changes in the types of plants that we have. And I'll make it quick. When we bought a house, I wanted a pretty tree. And I got a red bud. The guy said, yeah, it's not going to make it in Massachusetts. Now we have 5, and they've grown to seed, and they're blooming. So there's a real change. I've watched it over 20 years.
Yeah.
As I garden. In what plants are making it and what aren't. This is the first year we've had no forsythia in bloom because of the way our climate's going. We lost peaches, we lost apples.
Yeah, we had no peaches last year in Massachusetts.
We lost cherry. I have a 40-year-old, 30-foot cherry tree that lost all of its leaves and all of its blossoms. We don't know what's going to make it. It's 50 years old. Anyway, when you're thinking about planting to increase the carbon absorption in towns or cities or wherever, if you're increasing, are you looking at, well, what trees are going to make it in New England if we continue to change? Will our oaks be viable? Will our maples be viable? I'm seeing stuff I've never seen coming up in my garden. What out 25 years is going to be making it? Will there be maples? Will there be apples?
I know some people have done research on that, and I think UMass Extension, Ag Extension would be the best place to look. I really don't know enough to tell you. I know, what is it, the New England Wildflower Society or the what's the one in Framingham? I can't remember the name of it.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, okay, I think they may have some information
I'm
too.
thinking about if you're planting in the city with a long view.
Yeah.
If you want tall, healthy, big trees.
Yes.
Where are our natural native trees going to be 25 years from now?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. I know that there's a lot of research going into which trees survive urban environments better, and it's less about selecting the right tree, it's more about how do you take care of that tree over time. Cities often don't have budgets to take care of trees. So that's one big gap. We also don't have enough native vegetation being provided by our nurseries. So we're trying to figure out whether the state is going to be willing to fund a big nursery. They do that for oysters. They do that for a lot of shellfish. There are areas where the state will help fund a private entity that's raising oyster culture that then gets put in the water. Can we do the same thing for trees and vegetation? And can we get nurseries to reduce the amount of non-native vegetation that they sell? Because that can take over. I don't know, who else has a big problem with garlic mustard or mustard garlic? Yeah. Huge. I can't count the hours that I've spent doing that. Yeah, I've never made pesto from it, though, which I've heard is good.
Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Deb.
There was a thing I heard in the news just recently about a ruckus out around Quabbin where somebody was complaining about commercial logging in the forest.
Yeah, Wendell State Forest, there were protests out there, yeah.
Having spent 15 to 20 years doing PSI work, timber stand improvement, I wondered whether the state is thinking about bigger trees or the money they get from bigger trees.
Well, I'd say the state's thinking about how to do better climate smart management and management for biodiversity. And the report that came out just this week has a lot of good recommendations that will be implemented by the two major agencies, the landowning agencies, Department of Conservation and Recreation, Department of Fish and Game. And there will be a role for reserves in protecting those forests. There will be a role for managing those forests, which will enable some timbering of places where it's not overly sensitive, and there will be a role for restoring those forests. So it was a very thoughtful approach. They had 12 PhDs. One of our PhD scientists was on this panel. And some of the folks who were involved, who had the concerns about forest management, one of their leaders was a PhD scientist, Bill Mumma, was on that panel. So I think it's always a challenge to find that, to thread that needle. You know, where do you find it? I'm on a commission right now that is looking at how do we cite solar energy, how do we cite transmission, and how do we cite battery storage? And how do we do it quickly enough without trashing the environment or harming environmental justice communities? And what regulatory tools do we need for site suitability to say don't go here or it's okay to go here? And what incentives do we need to help it move along? So that's keeping me up nights.
Further question related. Who manages the area around Quabbin anyway?
I don't know enough to say. I believe.
The organizations you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know enough to say. I know Department of Conservation and Recreation manages part of it. I'm trying to remember who is in charge of water supply protection lands. I know DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, provides some of the funding for that, but I think DCR manages a lot of that land. I wish I knew enough to say. There's only so much brain space.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.